The sky was red and full of smoke and fire, and the sun was hidden behind thick black clouds that never moved and never faded, and the air was dry and full of dust that made it hard to breathe for anyone who was not used to this place. This place was called Korgotha's Pit, and it was not on earth, and it was not a place where kindness lived or where good things happened, and no one who came here came by choice unless they had something dark to sell or something darker to buy. At the center of the pit was a huge metal dome with rusted walls and giant spikes and fire burning in great bowls of iron and screams echoing from within the shadows, and above it all were banners made from skin and bones and skulls hanging like decorations. For monsters inside the dome, the market was loud and wild and full of all kinds of alien creatures shouting and laughing and fighting and trading as they moved between cages and pens and display pits where other beings were locked and chained and shown off like animals. Most of them were scared and hungry and broken with collars around their necks and numbers burned into their skin and their eyes wide with fear as they waited to see who would buy them and for what dark reason, and no one ever came to save them or speak kind words or look at them with anything but hunger or cruelty. And then came the moment when the next slave was pushed forward through the metal gate by a fat green beast with 6 arms and a whip in one hand and a brand in the other, and the girl fell to her knees on the metal floor with her arms covering her face and her thin body shaking. It was not like the others in the market because she had pale blue skin that glowed faintly in the firelight, and long silver hair that hung like a waterfall down her back, and her eyes were large and violet, and full of something strange and quiet like hope that was almost gone, but not dead. Yet the crowd saw her and gasped, and many shouted offers right away because she was rare and beautiful and young, and she looked fragile and soft and easy to break, and they laughed and jeered, and some reached out to touch her, but the guards beat them back. She said nothing as they shouted, but she turned her head and looked at the crowd, and her eyes moved slowly until they stopped on one face that did not shout or laugh or move with the others, and this face was not like the others because it was human. His name was Rook, and he wore dark armor with scars and burns and dents, and a long coat with a hood pulled low over his face, and a weapon on his back that no one could name, and a silence around him that made others stay away even if they didn't know why. He stood still near the back of the crowd and watched the girl, and she looked at him, and something passed between them, something quiet and strong and full of fear and pain, and maybe a question too, and she opened her mouth, but no sound came at first. Then she spoke not with her lips, but through the old mind link that some species could still use when they were desperate, and her voice was weak and soft and full of trembling, and it reached only him like a whisper carried on wind no one else could hear. Hold me, she said, and her voice cracked like she had not spoken in years, or like speaking still hurt. But she spoke anyway, and her voice grew stronger. Use me, she said, and her eyes burned into his, and she did not look away, and she did not cry. Just save me, she said, and her voice broke again, and her head dropped as the guard yanked her chain and dragged her forward to the auction stand. Rook did not move, and his face did not change, but inside his chest something stirred, something that had not moved in a long time. And it was not just anger or guilt or memory, but something deeper and colder and more dangerous. He had come here for another reason, for a mission he had not told anyone about, in a secret no one else knew, and he had promised himself not to get involved, not to interfere, not to let the past grab him again and drag him down. But her voice echoed in his head, and her eyes burned in his mind, and her words hit something in him that had been silent for too long, and it hurt in a way he could not ignore. The auctioneer raised a long metal rod and shouted out her name and number and started the bidding, and the crowd screamed and threw up coins and credits and trade chips and weapons and drugs and promises of death or worse. And Rook raised one hand. The crowd stopped and turned and stared because no one expected the human to bid, and no one thought he was rich or foolish or mad enough to try. And the auctioneer blinked with surprise before asking the bid amount. Rook spoke only once, and his number was high, too high for anyone else to match, and the crowd grew quiet because they knew this price was final. The auctioneer laughed and banged the rod and shouted that the girl was sold to the human, and the guard dragged her forward and dropped the chain in Rook's hand. She knelt at his feet and did not look up and did not speak, and her hands were shaking, and her breath was shallow like she expected pain or commands or worse. But Rook took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders and gently lifted her to her feet without pulling the chain or raising his voice, and he looked down at her, and said nothing. She looked up slowly, and her eyes were wide with confusion and disbelief, and her lips trembled, and she leaned closer and whispered again with her real voice this time. "Why?" she said, and her voice was smaller than before, like the wind had gone out of her completely. "Why did you buy?" Miruk looked past her at the guards, and the crowd, and the firelight, and the metal, and the filth, and the chains. And then he looked back at her. He still said nothing, but in his eyes was something the girl had not seen in years, not on this planet, not in the market, and not in the faces of those who had owned her or hunted her or used hair. In his eyes was something old and broken and quiet and still full of rage. He turned and walked away with the girl following beside him in silence, and the cloak around her, and her eyes fixed on his back like it was the only thing keeping her from falling. And far above the dome the clouds boiled and cracked with distant thunder, and the stars blinked behind the smoke like they were watching and waiting for what would come next. The wind outside the dome howled like a hungry beast, and the dust flew in thick sheets across the wasteland, as if the planet itself wanted to wipe away the horrors inside the market. But the walls stood strong and thick and full of blood and pain that would not wash away so easily. Rook stepped through the gates with the girl behind him, still wrapped in his coat and still holding the chain that trailed from her collar, though he had not pulled it once since taking it from the guard. And still she followed him without needing a word or a command. They moved through the outer market where the sellers displayed weapons and poisons and rare skins and ancient tech dug from broken ships buried deep in the sand, and everyone stared as they passed, because it was rare to see a human here, and even more rare to see one with a living slave who still looked alive. Rook ignored them all and kept walking, and the girl stayed close behind with her head down and her eyes alert, watching every shadow, every alley, every rooftop, as if she knew danger could leap out at any moment. And she was right, because it could, and it would. He led her into a dark corner of the market where the light was low and the noise faded and the air was thick with steam and the smell of metal and old oil. And they entered a storage room guarded by a bot with 3 glowing eyes and a scanner arm that beeped once and let them through without a word. Inside the room were shelves full of boxes and crates and sealed weapons and food packs and old gear, and in the back was a steel door with a keypad, and behind that door was safety of a kind, though nothing was truly safe on this planet, and both of them knew that. He opened the door and let her in and let the door shut behind them. And finally she stood still and looked around and saw that the room had a small heater and a mat on the floor and a sink in the wall and 1 chair made of metal and nothing else. "This is yours now," he said without turning, and his voice was low and rough like gravel scraped across iron. And she blinked, because it was the first time he had spoken to her with real words. She moved to the mat and sat down slowly and wrapped his coat tighter around herself, and her eyes followed him as he opened a panel on the wall and pulled out a sealed box and took a meal pack from inside and tossed it to her. "Eat," he said, and sat in the chair with his back to the wall and his weapon across his knees and his hood down now so she could see more of his face and the old scars that crossed it like lines drawn in fire long ago. She opened the pack with shaking hands and ate slowly and carefully, and her eyes never left him. And after a while she spoke in a voice that was soft and full of questions. "You are not like the others," she said. And he said nothing and kept watching the door and listening for sounds beyond the metal. "You did not touch me or mark me or pull the chain, and you gave me food and clothes in this space, and no one here does that. No one ever has." He looked at her now, and she saw that his eyes were gray like steel under ash and filled with something heavy like old fire still burning deep inside. "I did not come here to buy a slave," he said, and the words were slow like he was forcing them out one by one. "I came here to end something that should have died a long time ago. But when I saw you, I remembered what they did to us on Garrison 9, and I remembered what it felt like to be caged and sold and broken." Her breath caught, and she nodded slowly, because she knew of that place, though she had never been there, and the stories of it were passed among the slaves like warnings or ghosts. She put the food aside and crawled a little closer, though she did not touch him, and she said thank you in a voice so quiet it was almost not there. He looked away and did not answer, and she did not speak again for a long time. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes, because time had a strange way of moving on this planet. And in this room it was quiet and warm and safer than anywhere she had been in years. Then there was a soft sound at the door like a whisper on the metal, and Rook stood at once with his weapon raised and his body still like stone. And she moved back to the mat and covered herself again, though now her eyes were sharp, not afraid, but ready. A voice came through the door, through the old speaker, crackling and harsh, and full of laughter. Human, the voice said, "You surprised me back there, but now I understand you are one of those mercenary types with a bleeding heart and a death wish." Rook did not answer, and the voice kept talking. "You think you can walk into my market and take what is mine and leave like a ghost, but ghosts do not bleed, and I know your name now, and I know your face, and the bounty on your head just tripled." She looked at Rook and saw that he was calm and still, and his finger on the trigger did not shake, and his eyes were on the door like they could burn through it. "I am not afraid of warlords," Rook said finally, and his voice was quiet and cold like ice under fire. The voice on the speaker laughed again and said, "We will see about that." And then there was only silence. Rook lowered the weapon and turned to her, and she did not flinch when he looked at her, and that surprised him, though he did not show it. "We cannot stay here," he said. "They will come for you, and they will come for me, and they will not stop until one of us is dead." She stood slowly and let the coat fall away, and her skin glowed again, faint and soft, and her eyes were bright with something fierce. "Then take me with you," she said, and there was no fear in her voice now. "I am not afraid to run or to fight or to die, but I will not go back, and I will not be caged again." Rook watched her for a long moment, and then nodded once and moved to the panel and opened another box and pulled out gear and weapons. The night air was thick with smoke, and the wind carried the stench of rust and blood and oil across the dunes and the broken metal towers, and the old bones scattered across the wasteland like whispers of forgotten wars that never truly ended. Rook moved fast and low with his head down and his steps silent as he led the girl through the lower tunnels beneath the outer market, where the lights flickered and the walls were wet with moisture that was not water, and the shadows moved like they were alive. The girl followed close behind without asking questions and without slowing down, even when her bare feet slipped on the steel, or when her breath caught in her throat, or when the distant sounds of footsteps echoed behind them like the ghosts of hunters already closing in. She did not need to ask where they were going, because she already knew they were not running towards safety, but away from the people who would never stop hunting her as long as she breathed, and away from the market that had taken her name and her voice and her future and tried to sell them for scraps. Rook had not spoken since they left the storage room, and the silence between them felt sharp and heavy like a blade waiting to be drawn, and yet somehow the silence did not feel empty, because it was filled with purpose and fire and something new that the girl did not yet have words for. They reached a narrow shaft covered by a rusted grate, and Rook knelt and pulled it loose with a grunt and waved her through, and she climbed down without hesitation, even when the darkness swallowed her and the heat rose from below like the breath of something sleeping and angry. Rook followed and sealed the grate above them, and they dropped into a world of metal pipes and red steam and glowing fungus that grew between the cracks and lit the tunnel with a faint green glow like the breath of the planet itself bleeding out into the dark. "This tunnel runs beneath the outer fence," he said finally, his voice low and quiet and steady like a river under ice, "and we have to move fast before the hounds catch our scent or before the drones pick up our trail." The girl nodded and kept pace, and though her legs trembled, she did not fall behind, and her eyes never stopped searching the walls and the floor and the corners for traps or signs or sounds that didn't belong. They crawled and ran and climbed and dropped through the twisting maze of tunnels for what felt like hours, and every so often Rook would stop and place a small black device on the wall that blinked once and then disappeared into the metal like it had never been there. "Are those bombs?" she asked once, and he nodded and said, "They're our insurance policy," and she did not ask what he meant, because she already knew that death was something he carried with him like a tool and not a fear. Soon the tunnel opened into a wide chamber where the walls were covered in old banners and the remains of machines that had not worked in years, and the ground was littered with broken crates and empty shell casings and the bones of those who had tried to escape before and failed. Rook paused and scanned the room with sharp eyes and pointed to a ladder in the far corner and whispered, "We climb, and then we run, and then we vanish." But before they could move, a sound cut through the silence like a blade, a high whine that grew louder and sharper, and then a blue light burst through the far wall as a flying drone spun into view with red eyes and spinning blades and a gun mounted beneath its belly. "Down!" he shouted, and grabbed the girl and pulled her behind a crate as the drone opened fire and plasma bolts tore through the air and lit the chamber like a lightning storm inside. Tomb she covered her head and curled close to him as the blast struck the floor and the walls, and the metal screamed under the heat, and sparks flew across her skin and stung like fire. But she did not cry out. Rook rolled away and fired his weapon. And the bolt struck the drone in one eye, and it jerked back, but did not fall, and it screamed a siren that shook the walls, and then returned fire, ducked, and shouted, "Go to the ladder now, move," and she ran across the chamber with the bolts tearing the ground behind her, and her feet slipping on blood and ash, but she reached the ladder and climbed, and did not stop, even when her arms burned and her legs shook. Rook fired again, and this time the bolt hit the drone's engine, and it burst in a spray of blue flame and crashed into the wall and exploded in a cloud of smoke and light and dust that swallowed the chamber. He ran to the ladder and climbed fast and caught up with her at the top, and together they pulled open the hatch and crawled into the open desert under a sky full of stars and no moon and the cold wind that felt like knives on their skin. They ran across the sand with the pit behind them, now a dark shape full of fire and screams and hate, and ahead of them was only the night and the sound of their breath and the pounding of their hearts. After a while, when the lights of the market were no longer in sight, Rook slowed and pointed to a rocky outcrop shaped like a claw and said, "We rest there for an hour." "No more," and she nodded and followed him. They reached the rocks and crawled into the space beneath them where the wind could not reach, and the sand was still and warm, and the stars looked down like silent eyes full of questions, and the girl lay back and closed her eyes for the first time. Without chains, Rook sat nearby with his weapon across his knees and his ears open to every sound, and his mind turning over plans and risks and exits and what would come next, because he knew this was only the first step, and the worst was still ahead. After a long time, she opened her eyes and looked at him and said, "I never asked your name." And he looked at her and said, "Rook," and she smiled just a little and said, "I'm Illyra." And for a moment neither of them moved or spoke, and something passed between them that felt like the beginning of something neither of them had known before. "You didn't have to help me," she said, and her voice was soft but clear and strong, and he looked away and said, "No. I didn't, but I couldn't watch it happen again, not after what I saw on Garrison 9, and not after what they did to my crew, and not after what they did to me." She sat up and moved closer, and her eyes were full of something bright like fire that refused to go out even in the darkest place. And she said, "Then we fight together, and I'll never be a prisoner again, not while I have breath in my body." Rook looked at her and nodded, and said, "Then we don't stop, not until the pit is ash and the chains are dust, and the ones who built that market are buried beneath it." And as the wind rose again, and the stars shifted above them, and the night grew colder, they sat together in silence and watched the edge of the world, waiting for the dawn that had not yet come, but would come soon. And in that silence was something new and dangerous and powerful, a bond forged not by blood or history, but by fire and survival, and the promise that no one would ever own them again. The night stretched on without sound except for the soft whisper of wind over sand and rock, and the slow, steady breathing of two souls who had escaped the jaws of the pit and now rested beneath the claw-shaped ridge that stood like the skeleton of an old god forgotten by time. And Illyra watched the sky as stars moved above her in slow, graceful arcs, and she imagined them as eyes not cold or distant, but kind and ancient, and watching her for the first time with something that might be called care. She lay on her side with the coat wrapped tight around her, and her hands curled near her chest, and her body still tense from the escape. But slowly that tension was melting like frost under morning light. Rook sat nearby with his weapon resting against his shoulder and his back to the rock wall, and his eyes half closed, but never truly asleep, and his ears tuned to every gust of wind and every shifting grain of sand. He had not said much since they fled the market, but his silence was not heavy or cruel, and Illyra found comfort in knowing that if danger came, he would be the first to stand between her and the storm. After some time, she sat up and turned to him, her voice low but steady as she spoke through the stillness. "Do you want to know who I was before the pit?" she asked, and her eyes held no tears now, only something older than fear, something that came from remembering what it meant to exist before cages. Rook looked at her and gave a small nod and waited without pressing, without pushing. "My name is Illyra," she said again, more firmly this time, "and I was born on a world called Sorith, a green world full of trees that reached the clouds and rivers that sang like birds and skies that changed color when we sang back to Then she smiled for a second as if seeing that place in her mind. And then the smile faded like a wave pulled back into deep cold sight. It was taken when I was 7 by slavers who raided during the harvest. They came in ships that screamed and dropped fire and smoke onto the fields, and my people ran. But I was not fast enough, and my mother was pulled away from me, and I never saw her again. They put me in a cage and burned a number into my shoulder, and that number is still there even now even. After all the years, even after the flesh healed and the pain faded, because the mark is not just skin, it is memory, and memory does not heal with time. Rook listened and did not interrupt, and his jaw clenched slightly, but he said nothing because there was nothing to say that could fix what had been done. They moved me from ship to ship and planet to planet, always in chains, always hungry, always watched. And whenever one owner got bored, I was sold to another, and the only thing I learned was how to stay quiet and how to disappear without moving. And then they brought me to the pit. Tillera looked down at her hands and flexed her fingers slowly, as if checking they were still hers, still whole, still free. At first, I thought I might die there. And part of me wanted to, but I couldn't let go of the voice inside me that kept whispering that maybe someone would come, someone who wouldn't see me as meat or a tool or a toy, someone who would see me as a person again. Her voice cracked a little, and she looked away from him toward the stars again, and her next words were softer. When I saw you, I thought maybe that voice had lied to me again, but then you gave me your coat, and you didn't touch me, and you didn't speak to me like I was a thing, and for the first time in years I felt like I was real again. Rook leaned forward and placed his weapon on the sand, and his voice came quiet and rough like gravel under windy, was stationed on Garrison 9 during the last year of the war, and our ship was hit by pirates on the way back to Earth. We were stranded for months and captured by a mercenary outfit that made money selling prisoners to labs and blood pits. They took my team and put me in a room and forced me to watch what they did to the others, and I survived only because I broke out and burned the whole place to the ground. But the faces of my crew never left me, and never will. He looked at Illyra, and his eyes were full of the same storm she had seen the night before. That fire and silence wrapped together like a blade waiting to strike. That's why I couldn't walk away when I saw you, he said, not because I'm a hero or good, but because I know what it means to be forgotten, and I swore I would never be the kind of man who lets it happen again. Illyra reached over slowly and touched his arm just lightly, just enough to say she heard him and that it mattered. She said, tell me the plan, and he nodded once and pulled out a small device shaped like a cube with lights that blinked in patterns she did not understand. This is a tracker beacon, he said, old tech, but still strong enough to reach one of the hidden relays in orbit. I've been placing amplifiers along the way since we escaped. If we can reach the next tower and boost the signal, my ship will come to us within a day. And the warlords, she asked, will they let us? Gothi won't, he said. They'll send hunters and drones and worse. But if we keep moving and hit the relay before they cut the signal, we have a chance. She looked at the stars again, and then back at him, and nodded with a fire in her chest that was not fear anymore, but something hotter, something that had waited years to burn. Then let's make them chase us, she said. Let them run until they're too tired to breathe, and then we end them all. Rook gave her a look that might have been a smile, or maybe just pride, and he stood and dusted off his coat, and slung the weapon over his shoulder, and offered his hand to her. She took it and rose with him, and together they moved away from the rock and into the deeper dark where the sky met the sand and the wind whispered around them like a song forgotten by time. They walked in silence for a while, and though the path ahead was unknown and full of death and risk and pain, neither of them looked back, because what lay behind them was worse, because what lay ahead was freedom, because now they walked not as a slave and a soldier, but as two people who had nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for. The sun rose like a blade over the horizon, spilling red light across the sand and rock and rusted wreckage that covered the land like the bones of a dead empire, and the wind carried the scent of smoke and old metal and something else older something. Watching Illyra and Rook move through the dunes with steady steps, their shadows long behind them, and the silence between them strong and unbroken as they followed the broken path through the dead zone where nothing grew and nothing lived except the hunters and the ghosts. Each step took them farther from the pit, but closer to something else, something they could feel in the air and in their bones, like the hum before lightning or the breath before fire. They stopped only once when Rook held up his hand and pointed to the ridge ahead where a dark shape stood on two legs, scanning the desert with long arms and a head that turned too smoothly to be alive. A scout drone, Rook said, and dropped to one knee, pulling Illyra down with him and wrapping the cloak tighter around her shoulders to hide the glow of her skin. It hovered for a moment, then turned and vanished into the sky, leaving only a trail of light behind like a scar across the sky. That means they're close, he said, which means we move now or we never move again. Illyra nodded and stood without fear, her eyes sharper now, her breath steady, her hands ready. They moved again, faster, now cutting across the land like shadows, sliding between the broken walls and crumbling towers left by a war no one remembered and no one ever won. At the edge of the valley, they stopped beneath the husk of a ship that had crashed long ago, its hull split open like a wound, and the metal black with age and flame. Inside was darkness and silence, and a console buried under dust and sand and wires like vines reaching from a dead tree. Rook cleared the panel and placed one of his amplifiers inside, locking it into the relay and pressing a sequence of buttons that lit the wires with blue light like veins awakening from sleep. That's the third one, he said. One more, and we can call the ship, but that means we're out of time. Illyra looked around and felt the weight of eyes in the air. Even if she could not see them, she knew they were coming. She knew the warlord would never stop hunting them, not after the price Rook had placed on his pride. She turned to him and said, "We can't keep running, we need to fight." Rook shook his head. "Not here, not yet. We fight now, and we lose, but if we reach the tower, we fight with the sky on our side. Then we better run faster," she said, and they moved again, out into the light, into the heat, into the wind that burned their faces and dried their mouths. Behind them on the ridge, the first wave appeared, riding beasts with black hides and mouths full of metal teeth and eyes that glowed red under the helmets of their riders. The hunters of the pit, not soldiers, not machines, but something in between, grown in vats and trained with pain and blood and hunger. They moved fast and silent, leaving no trail but death and dust, and they did not care who they killed or how they died, only that the prey did not escape. Rook saw them and cursed under his breath and pulled Illyra behind a dune, firing 3 quick shots at the ridge, and one of the beasts screamed and fell tumbling into the sand. "Keep moving," he shouted, and Illyra ran, not because she was afraid, but because the time to fight had not come. Not yet. They reached the canyon, a narrow cut through black stone with walls high enough to hide them for a moment and give them a chance to breathe and think. Inside, the shade was cool and the air still, and Illyra leaned against the wall, catching her breath as Rook reloaded his weapon and scanned the mouth of the canyon. "We'll block the entrance," he said, and pulled out a charge from his belt. "One blast, and the rocks will fall and slow them down." Illyra nodded and stepped forward to help, placing the charge on a weak point in the stone, while Rook covered her and listened for the sound of claws on rock. The blast echoed like thunder, and the dust rose high and thick as the canyon mouth collapsed in a wall of stone and fire, and for a moment there was silence, then a howl from above, a sound that tore through the sky like a beast crying for blood, and the shadow of a drone passed over them, circling once, then vanishing. "They found us," Illyra said, and Rook nodded again, not surprised, only angry. "We close now," he said, and pointed to the spire rising in the distance like a finger of steel reaching into the clouds. "That's the tower, the last relay, the final piece of the signal. If we reach it, we're out. If we fall here. Then let's fly," she said, and smiled, not because she was safe, but because she finally knew what it felt like to have a choice. They left the canyon and crossed the last stretch of desert under the shadow of the tower, moving fast, dodging wreckage, and skimming past mines buried in the sand. Marked only by bones. At the base of the tower was a gate, rusted and half open, and guarded by 2 sentries in black armor, with rifles slung across their backs and eyes hidden behind masks. They did not expect an attack. They did not see Rook coming until it was too late. And then they were gone. Inside the tower was dark and quiet and filled with the hum of old power, the sound of machines still breathing. After all these years, Rook found the console near the center and placed the final amplifier into the slot, pressing the activation sequence and waiting for the signal light to blink. Greenillera stood near the doorway, watching the sand, watching the sky, watching the future rise from the past. Then the console beeped, and the signal flashed, and the beacon screamed into space faster than light, and far above the orbiting relay caught it and threw it across the void toward the waiting ship. It's done, Rook said. Now we hold until it comes, or until we die. Illera stepped beside him and placed her hand on the console and said, then we hold. The wind outside changed, and the sound of hooves and claws and metal echoed across the desert, louder, now closer. Now the hunters had found them. The warlord had sent everything he had, and the final storm was coming. Rook placed his hand on her shoulder and looked into her eyes and saw not the girl from the cage, not the slave from the market, not the voice that begged to be used and saved. He saw Illera, and Illera saw him, not just the soldier, not just the weapon, not just the silent ghost from a lost war. She saw Rook, and they turned together toward the door, toward the sand, toward the fight, because they were no longer running, because now they would stand, because sometimes the hunted become the storm. The ground shook beneath their feet as the sound of beasts and war machines rose from the horizon, carried by the wind like a warning drum that beat faster with every heartbeat, and the dust lifted into the sky in thick waves as if the world itself was rising in anger. Illera stood at the edge of the tower's shadow, her eyes locked on the ridge where the warlord's forces were now pouring over like a flood of metal and hate, and her hand gripped the blaster tightly, though her knuckles were white and her arms were shaking beside her. Rook finished the last connection on the console, sealing the signal into the relay with one final code, and watching the green pulse flicker to life and begin transmitting across the stars to the place where his ship waited in silence beyond the reach of fire and chains. He turned to Illera and gave her a single nod, a wordless message that meant it is done, and she answered with her eyes and her breath, in the way she did not move from the path of the storm. They had minutes, maybe less, before the hunters arrived and the drones would follow, and then the warlord himself would descend from the sky in his throne of bone and steel, ready to reclaim what he believed was his. But Rook and Illera were not his anymore, not now, not ever again. The tower was tall and hollow, filled with the hum of forgotten tech and the pulse of ancient circuits that still remembered what it meant to defy death and time, and its walls had seen other battles and had survived them, and now it would see one more. They climbed to the second level through a narrow stairwell, where light flickered from broken panels, and the wind whistled through holes in the metal, and the distant sounds of gunfire echoed like thunder in a dying dream. Rook placed explosives along the lower supports, not to destroy the tower, but to bury the doors if needed, to trap the enemy outside or bury them within, and Illera watched and learned and remembered every motion, because she knew there would be a time when she would need to use them alone. They reached the top, where the sky stretched open and endless, and the stars still blinked above, though the sun had not yet fallen, and the air was sharp and clean like a blade and full of waiting. Rook raised his scope and scanned the horizon and saw them coming fast, a wave of black armor and red eyes and smoke trails behind hovering bikes and beasts that moved like wolves with steel jaws and plasma breath, and in the center of them a larger shape, too far to see clearly, but already he knew the warlord was coming, and he was not coming to negotiate. Illera stood beside him and took a deep breath and asked how long until the ship arrives, and Rook checked the signal tracker and said 10 minutes, maybe more if the atmosphere slows the drop. Then we hold for 10, she said, and if they get through before, then we hold anyway, Rook said, and there was no fear in his voice, only steel and memory, and something that sounded like peace. The first drones appeared over the ridge, circling like vultures and scanning for heat and motion, and the tower flashed once as the signal interfered with their scans, and for a moment, they hesitated. Rook opened fire with a sharp burst, and the lead drone exploded in a bloom of sparks and smoke, and the others scattered for cover behind the jagged hills where the hunters waited for the charge. "They are testing us," Illyra said. "They want to see how hard we'll fight before they break us. Then let's break them first," Rook replied, and handed her the second rifle from his bag, heavy and old, but strong, and she took it without a word. The first wave came fast, 3 bikes and 2 beasts bounding across the sand, their riders armed with shock spears and blades that glowed with blue heat, and behind them the drones followed low and close. Rook fired once and dropped a rider from his bike, spinning it into the sand, and Illyra took down a drone with a shot that cracked the air and made the metal scream as it fell. They moved together, not like strangers or survivors, but like fighters who had trained in the same wars and bled in the same dirt and learned to read each other's breath and eyes. In silence, the battle grew louder, and the tower shook as more blasts struck the outer walls, and the hunters climbed the rocks, trying to reach the windows with claws and blades and ropes. Illyra dropped another drone, then turned and fired through a broken panel, striking a beast in the neck and sending it tumbling down the cliff with its rider screaming all the way. Rook set the charges at the stairwell and armed them with a 5-second trigger, then pulled back and nodded to her. They fell to the second level just as the enemy broke through the top, and the blast tore through the stairwell, filling the air with dust and fire and limbs and silence. More came from the ground, climbing the outer walls like insects with weapons and teeth, and no fear, and Rook threw 2 grenades through the side gaps, watching them bounce before the light swallowed the window, and the screams returned. The signal was still strong, the console flashing green and steady, and the beacon reaching out into the sky like a voice calling home. And Illyra prayed silently to a name she no longer remembered. That the ship had heard them. The wall burst inward, and one of the hunters landed inside, swinging a blade that cut the air with a hum, and Illyra rolled beneath it and fired up into his chest, sending him crashing into the corner where he twitched once and stopped. 2 more came, and Rook took one down with a single shot and fought the second, hand to hand, locking blades and fists until the creature howled and Rook slammed its head into the wall again and again until it dropped and did not rise. They were bleeding now, both of them, cuts and burns and bruises, and their backs pressed against the core as the tower shook again, and the signal stuttered for a breath before returning. Illyra looked at Rook and said, "If we die here, it still matters." And he looked back and said, "We're not dying yet." And then the light outside changed. A new roar filled the sky, one that came not from machines or beasts, but from something above something falling, something large and sharp and full of fire. The ship was coming. A sleek black form pierced the clouds, trailing blue flame and breaking sound as it dropped toward the tower, guns already charging and sensors locking onto targets. The hunters turned and scattered as the sky lit up with laser fire, and the sand exploded beneath the force of the landing, and the roar of engines drowned out the screams. Rook grabbed Illyra's hand and pulled her toward the platform where the landing bay had opened with a hiss, and a ramp dropped down, shaking the ground as it touched the earth. They ran together through smoke and fire, and the wind whipped around them, carrying the heat of the battle and the cold of the stars and the sound of hope behind them. The warlord stepped from his cruiser, his armor shining with blood and his eyes fixed on them, and he raised his weapon and fired. The shot struck Rook in the side, and he staggered but did not fall, and Illyra screamed and fired back. The stars were quiet above them, silent and ancient as the ship sliced through space, leaving the burned skies of the warlord's world behind like dust forgotten on the wind, and inside the cold metal walls of the med bay the hum of machines and the rhythm of healing kept time with the rise and fall of breath. Illyra sat beside Rook, her hand never leaving his fingers, her eyes wide and full of questions she could not yet ask, and he lay still, pale and torn, but alive, the med gel patch pulsing softly over his side where the warlord's blast had cut deep. The crew had not spoken much. They knew the man who now lay resting had walked through fire and come back, carrying not gold or weapons, but something far heavier than both, a girl who was never meant to be free and a truth no longer hidden. The ship's AI had already logged the distress signal, the tower's transmission, the battle data, and the warlord's signature. The galaxy would soon hear whispers of the fight of the Defiance, of the human who challenged one of the old powers, not for glory, not for profit, but for something ancient and nearly forgotten, kindness. Rook stirred as the med nanotubes pulled away, their job complete, though his breath was slow. His eyes opened and found her again like they had in the market that day when chains still bound her and fear ruled her bones. "You made it," he whispered, though his voice cracked like old ice. "I told you not to die," she replied, and her fingers gripped his tighter as if afraid that letting go would pull her back into the dark place where no one came to save her. "Save me too," he said, and there was something behind his words that sounded like more than pain or thanks, something softer than survival and older than war. She smiled, but her face trembled, and she said, "I was afraid you would not make it. I was afraid I would lose the only one who saw me." "You are not lost," he said, "and you are not alone, and you are not what they made you believe." His words filled the small space between them like light filling a cave, and she felt something inside her shift, something that had been frozen for years starting to move again. Rook sat up slowly, pain in every motion, but strength returning like fire in his blood. And he looked around at the ship, at the crew, at the stars outside the viewports, and finally back at her. "You're free now," he said. "You can go anywhere, do anything. This ship is yours if you want it, or you can leave at the next port, start a new life somewhere far from here." She looked at him and the stars and the place between all things and shook her head gently. "Not yet," she said. "I don't want to run anymore. I want to learn who I am without chains." "Then stay with me," he said. "We'll figure it out together." Illyra nodded once, and a small breath escaped her lips, not quite laughter, but close enough to hope, and she reached for the coat he had wrapped around her back in the market, its fabric still torn, but now warm with memory. The crew brought food, simple rations, and warm drinks, and they sat together in the common room where stories were traded in silence and glances, and no one asked why a human and a girl from a broken world shared the same chair or held the same pain outside the ship. Crossed systems moving toward the old colonies where friends and allies might still remember Rook, and where new voices might rise with theirs to speak against the empire of slavers and tyrant. Illyra trained with the crew each day, learning how to fight, how to fly, how to speak the codes and crack the locks and fire the weapons and read the stars. And though her body still carried scars, her eyes grew sharper and her voice steadier. She asked questions every day and listened even more, and the crew slowly saw the fire in her, not the fire of rage, but of purpose, and they began to follow her in small ways like how they once followed Rook. And when Rook saw this, he smiled, though he never said why. Weeks passed, and the warlord's name echoed through the back channels, twisted with shame and defeat, and fear, for the story had spread of how a single human stole from him a prize, and how his army failed, and how a girl once raised in chains now roamed the stars armed and unbroken. On a small moon orbiting a forgotten planet, the ship landed near an old outpost where resistance forces had gathered, whispers of rebellion turning louder with each passing day, and Rook stepped down first, followed by Illyra, wearing armor that fit her now, not just in size, but in meaning. The commander of the base met them with suspicion until she heard the name Rook and saw the girl, who stared without flinching and listened without fear, and then she knew they were what she had been waiting for. Rook shared what he had seen, what he had learned, the maps of the slave routes, the codes used by the warlord's network, and the locations of hidden camps where others like Illyra were still trapped, still waiting. And when the commander asked what they wanted in return, Illyra stepped forward and said, "We want to burn it all down." From that day, the plan began to grow. Ships were fueled, weapons loaded, alliances forged, and names gathered in secret, and each one swore to never stop until the last chain fell. In the quiet hours when the stars blinked outside the windows and the engines purred like beasts in sleep, Rook and Illyra would talk, sometimes of old wounds, sometimes of dreams, sometimes of silence, and sometimes of things not yet spoken. "Do you ever think of going back?" she asked one night. "Back to Earth, or wherever you came from?" Rook shook his head. "Not really," he said. "I left that behind a long time ago. This is my home now." She leaned against his side, her head resting just above the wound that had nearly taken him, and whispered, "Then maybe it's mine too." He did not answer, but his hand found hers and held it, and she closed her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she did not dream of cages or blood or running. She dreamed of stars and fire and voices that sang in languages she would one day understand, and she dreamed of her name not as something given by masters, but as something she had chosen herself. One cycle later, they stood before the new fleet, 12 ships, armed and ready, and the crew all wore the same symbol on their chests, a star broken open with a chain falling beneath it. Rook looked at her and asked, "Are you ready?" Illyra smiled and said, "I've never been more ready." And the engines roared and they fleet moved like a shadow across the sky, leaving behind the ashes of old empires and flying toward a future made not by rulers, but by those who once had no voice. The stars were no longer silent, they were calling.